The bulb over the kitchen table did not belong to the apartment, and Elena could not remember buying it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you excuse when you are tired and new. She had moved in 2 weeks earlier with 3 boxes of books, 1 suitcase, and a plant that had already forgiven her twice. The super, a man who looked like a folded ladder, had replaced the ancient fixture with a simple ceramic socket and told her to get any bulb she liked. She had meant to. She had meant to do many things. On the first night she cooked an egg, badly, and sat beneath the light. It hummed in a frequency she recognized from laundromats and waiting rooms, patient and impersonal. At midnight, when she turned the wall switch off, the hum stopped. The room darkened. The city outside made its usual shapes, a siren, a laugh, the long breath of traffic at 3 a.m. In the morning, she woke to light. The switch was still down. The bulb burned anyway, a steady pearl of brightness above the cold coffee mug and a note to herself that read, badly underlined, sleep. She stood on the chair and unscrewed the bulb with 2 careful fingers. It was neither hot nor cold. It was exactly the temperature of a hand you trust. When she held it up at eye level, something pale moved inside, only reflection, she told herself, only the room folded small. She set it on the counter and left for work. When she came home that evening, the bulb was back in the socket, the light on, her note rewritten in a steady hand that was not hers, rest. She laughed then, because language needs somewhere to go when fear is too busy. She turned the switch off and watched nothing happen. The light stayed on, faintly brighter in defiance. She unscrewed it again and carried it to the bedroom dresser, set it in a bowl like a round fruit. It lit the bowl from within, a domestic ghost. All night it burned, gentle and unarguable. The super said bad wiring. He wiggled the switch until it squealed a little and said he'd send an electrician. The electrician came, took the plate off the wall, and shook his head. "It's not drawing," he said. "It's not connected to anything." He looked at her as if she had wasted a good story on a bad audience. "Change the bulb," he said, and left her with a smile that wasn't polite enough to be unkind. She changed the bulb. The new one worked properly. It turned on and off like a trained animal. That night, at 2:17 a.m., the old bulb rolled itself out of the bowl and into the hallway, where she found it pressed against her bedroom door like a pet waiting for a better answer. When she picked it up, it warmed. When she set it on the table, it brightened. When she put it back in the socket, the kitchen felt less empty, the way rooms do when a lamp and a book agree to keep each other company. The light stayed on. It turned out that everyone on her floor knew not to ask questions. The woman in 3D held the elevator door and said, "We cover our clocks with scarves at night." The man in 3C never made eye contact and smelled like eucalyptus. When she asked if he ever had trouble with his lights, he said, "Only when they remember me," and the elevator reached the lobby. Elena began to measure the apartment by brightness instead of square footage. The bedroom was evening, the hallway was weather, the bathroom was a rehearsal for cold. The kitchen was noon. The light imposed its own time. She learned to sleep without darkness. She learned the weight of a perpetual glow, how it flattened the corners of things, made the shadows polite and thin. She taped a towel to the underside of the bulb to dim it while she ate. The towel browned slightly at the center and did not catch fire. She made a list of small miracles: coffee that never cooled, leftover soup that never remembered the refrigerator, a small plant that turned its leaves toward the ceiling at midnight. On the 4th week she noticed that the bulb did not cast a shadow of itself. Where it hung, light lived. Where it should have been, there was only more of the room. She started speaking to it the way you speak to a microwave when it is the only listener. "I'll write after this," she promised. "I'll do the emails. I'll call my mother on Sunday before noon." The bulb hummed, not encouragement, not disapproval, an ambient attention that made excuses sound louder. She asked the obvious question on a Tuesday she had not earned. "What are you?" The light did not flicker, the way haunted things are supposed to. The window glass reflected a blurred version of the room, a girl at a table with a lamp, trying not to be the kind of person who calls herself a girl after 30. When she rose at midnight to turn the switch off, Because ritual is a leash you can hold, the light held steady and then, for the first time, brightened. Not a warning. A response. She did not sleep. She made tea. She wrote names on a page she had left blank for months. She wrote apology and repeat and again and underlined them until the paper softened. At 3 a.m., the light thinned to a gentler white, like breath finding its pace after crying. When she woke at 7, the switch was up. She had not moved it. The light was still on. Her mother left a message that began, "I know you're busy," and ended with the weather. Her supervisor forwarded 3 emails with gentle reminder in the subject line. A man she had not thought about for a year wrote "Hey stranger" and attached a photo of a beach he had not invited her to. The light watched nothing and everything, unbribed by drama. She unscrewed the bulb and put it in her bag. At work, the open-plan office was full of screens and posture and caffeine. She placed the bulb in her desk's top drawer, cushioned by her spare sweater. At noon she opened the drawer to find the sweater lit from the inside like a confession. She closed it quickly. She took the bulb to the restroom and set it on the sink counter. It illuminated the mirror with a flatter, kinder version of her face, the one she might have had if food and sleep were easier words. She brought it home. "You should throw it away," someone said in her head. If the apartment was a mouth, the old pipes were its throat, the rising heat its temper. You should drop it down the chute and let the building decide. She carried it to the trash room and stood before the chute. The metal flap breathed cold at her. She could hear the building's heart, descending bottles, an avalanche of soft plastic, an occasional shout of aluminum. She did not drop it. She carried it back and told herself it was because she feared shards in a space where people walked barefoot. The truth had a longer name. Things started staying warm. The mug on the table. The wood of the chair where she draped a sweater. The pen she forgot uncapped. Her kitchen became a catalog of small mercies. When she placed her hand flat on the table, the grain felt animate, a quiet pulse under the varnish, like the building remembering it used to be a tree. At odd hours, the light brightened by a breath or dimmed as if thinking. When she opened the refrigerator, the bulb's glow reached across and softened the hard white of the appliance's light. When she stood very still, she could hear a second hum behind the first one, a lower tone, almost a vowel. She turned music on to drown it and discovered she could not hear the high strings of a symphony without seeing the bulb grow in tolerance and then ease. She turned the music off. The electrician returned with another man and a handheld device that beeped in a careful monotone. He clipped leads to the ceramic base and shrugged. "You're not crazy," he said, and Elena almost wept with gratitude for a sentence that simple. He unplugged the stove and the radio and the outlet where nothing was plugged. The light did not change. "It's not pulling," he said. "And it's not pushing." The second man asked if she lived alone. She said yes. He looked at her hands and repeated yes back to her as if classifying a word he had learned in another country. They left, promising a report. No report arrived. The super did not come back. Elena began leaving messages for the bulb. She wrote "stop" on a yellow sticky note and pressed it to the shade she had fashioned from a glass salad bowl. In the morning, the note read "stay." She wrote "who and found here." She wrote "why" and got "remember." When she laughed at that, because it was worse than silence, it was fortune cookies with a better education, the light brightened almost imperceptibly, as if warmed by being underestimated. The first brownout happened in August, on a night the city emptied into the parks and the apartment buildings struggled with their own heat. The lights went out across the block. Car alarms hiccuped, then surrendered to a minimal life. In Elena's kitchen, the bulb burned on, softer now, like the glow of a street lamp through fog. She stood at the window and watched people spill into the street with candles and questions. Her apartment felt like a lighthouse with no obligation. A moth landed on the screen, trembled, and did not move. For the first time, the bulb's brightness felt less like company and more like declaration. She turned the switch, which was nothing, a mood ring, and whispered, "Please, turn off." The bulb dimmed a fraction, the way eyes do when they are trying to keep a friend from making a mistake. In the hallway, someone knocked on doors and asked if anyone had light. Elena opened hers and stepped outside, leaving the light on the table. The corridor was a long, benevolent tunnel. The woman from 3D held a beeswax candle that made the air smell like an argument about honey. "You too?" the woman asked, nodding toward Elena's open door. The glow inside was visible from the hall, a rectangle of persistent dawn. "I can loan you a lamp," 3D offered. "It doesn't need to be plugged in," Elena said, and heard how that sounded the way one hears a dream after saying it aloud. 3D nodded as if they had agreed on something terrifying and domestic. "I lived in a house like that once," 3D said softly. "A porch light that stayed on after the divorce. We left it for a year." She looked down the hall, where darkness stacked itself carefully. "It helps to say thank you, even if you don't mean it yet." She touched Elena's arm like a map legend. "And don't cover mirrors." "Why?" 3D considered. "Because light needs somewhere to go when it leaves a room." That night the power stayed down. Elena sat at the table and watched the bulb speak in subtle changes. It did not flicker. It did not waver. It held, the way a steady hand holds a shoulder. Sometime after 2, a ring of paler light appeared inside the globe, a halo the size of a wedding band. It rose to the top of the glass and dissolved like breath. Elena reached up without meaning to and touched the bulb with 2 fingers. It was warm. It was exactly the temperature of a forehead you kiss when you don't know what else to do. "Thank you," she said. The hum lowered as if listening. She dreamed of stairwells without flights, of windows that did not know which side was outside. She dreamed of rooms that remembered her after she left. In the morning, the city returned to itself and pretended nothing had happened. The bulb burned on. Elena bought a lampshade that made it gentler. The month turned, and with it came an email from her ex with a subject line that meant "I miss having someone to tell news to." He had attached a photo of a lamp they had bought together in a thrift store, a brass heron with a shade like a storm. "Do you still have this?" he wrote, as if objects were a language only they could speak. She shut the laptop and made eggs that came out right on the second try. The bulb glowed. She thought of the word "tide" and did not open the email again. On a Friday that began with the cruelty of excellent weather, she came home to find the bulb brighter than it had ever been. The shade filled with milk-white light that threw no shadow and made the refrigerator blush. The plant on the windowsill turned every leaf toward the ceiling. Elena felt the hairs on her arms stand up the way fields stand up right before they are harvested. "Stop," she said. The light did not change. She put her hand on the wall beside the switch and felt a faint vibration, small as a heartbeat in someone who has been asleep for a long time. The hum resolved into syllables, not words but the shape of words, the way mouths meet air. She pressed her ear to the paint and heard the building breathing through its old lungs, and beneath that the faintest echo of her own voice, a recording played an inch away from being audible. She said, "Please." The light dimmed. The hum lowered to a tone that made her think of subterranean rivers and lines drawn on paper to convince people that worlds are manageable. She sat, suddenly and completely empty of performance, and laid her forehead on her arms. The light held. The room kept its promise to stay. After that, changes arrived like small weather. The bulb began to respond to questions she did not ask. When she put a bill on the table, the light brightened the due date. When she set down a photograph of a child she might one day meet, it glowed gentler, as if in warning or blessing. When she placed her open notebook under it, the paper warmed until her hand stopped shaking. The city's lights went about their business, the kitchen kept its own. Soon the bulb bled into the hallway. A faint corona edged the doorframe, as if the light were remembering how to leave. 3CS eucalyptus smell grew sweeter, and she heard laughter from behind his door at hours that suggested no one had learned to live alone efficiently. On the stairs, strangers paused and looked up at her floor, the way birds adjust when they pass a thermal column. Elena started opening her door at night and reading at the table so that the light spilled into the corridor for anyone who needed it. Once, the teenage boy from 3A sat outside her threshold with his back to her jam and did his math homework in the borrowed glow. He did not look in. He turned a page and said softly, "Thanks," to the air, and she raised her eyes from her book and said, "You're welcome," to the hallway. They understood each other and did not speak again. On the first cold snap in October, the light changed. It was a small shift in color, still white, but bluer, the difference between a morning that forgives and a morning that insists. Elena wore a sweater and drank tea and watched the glass. A hairline crack had appeared along the base, a crescent barely visible. She felt the petty panic of a child watching a balloon loosen its knot. "How long?" she asked. The light steadied. The crack did not widen. She stroked the cord reflexively, though it was only decoration. "It's okay," she said, and laughed at herself for speaking to a material. But the bulb had never felt like material. It had felt, from the second night, like an answer to a question she had not had the vocabulary to ask. The crack widened the next week. Only a millimeter. Enough to convince the plant to look elsewhere. Enough to make the light throw a tiny arc on the ceiling like a bough about to be loosed. She made a plan. She bought a new bulb and did not open its box. She made soup and left the pot on the stove with the gas off. She printed the emails she had ignored and slid them under the placemat. She wrote her mother's number on a card and set it beside the salt. On a Sunday morning she woke before the alarm she did not set and found the light dimmer, as if the bulb were remembering a cloud. She unscrewed it with both hands and held it over the sink. The glass was warmer than her forehead, the way a head feels when a fever breaks. She whispered, "Thank you," because 3D had told her to and because sometimes rules are simply well-kept maps. The bulb brightened once in her hands, a last small performance, and then went dark. The apartment did not collapse. The hum stopped. The kitchen turned into a kitchen. She breathed, in the large, ordinary way people do when they are only people. She set the bulb gently in the bowl. She washed her hands of nothing. When she put the new bulb in the socket and flipped the switch, the room looked wrong for a moment, too precise, edges too factual, shadows where they belonged like obedient pets. She stood very still and waited for grief to decide what shape it would take. It took several, the shape of making coffee for one, the shape of looking at a window and seeing only outside, the shape of telling herself stories about not needing singularities. On Tuesday she carried the old bulb in its bowl down to the basement. The building's storage room smelled like older versions of every tenant. She held the bulb up, it reflected a dim crescent of her face and a dozen boxes labeled with names she did not know. She considered the trash. She considered the shelf. She slid the bowl onto a high beam where the dust accepted it as an error. As she turned to leave, the motion sensor light clicked off and the basement fell into the kind of dark that has opinions. She stood very still and listened to the tiny delay between insufficiency and fear. In that interval, in that breath where the body waits to decide, she thought she saw the faintest bloom of light from the shelf above her, the smallest halo, a thimbleful of noon. It might have been her eyes reminding her not to humanize objects. It might have been goodbye. Upstairs, the apartment was all shadow, early evening pretending to be later. She closed the door, then opened it again because habits practice themselves. The new bulb lit obediently. She sat and ate soup that knew what soup was. The plant faced the window in the street light. For a week she slept without hum and woke without instructions. She did not tape notes to the lamp. The refrigerator went back to being absolute. She answered emails like someone polite in a line. She called her mother on a day that had nothing to recommend it. Their conversation did not need a glow. It had one anyway. On Friday night, she heard a knock at her door at an hour that belonged to cats and people who make mistakes. The hallway was a dim blue. Threya stood there with his poor posture and his math and two friends who tried to look like boredom. "Our light," he said, gesturing vaguely downward, went out. Elena stepped back. "You can sit here," she said, and felt relief as clean as a new floor. She opened her door wide. The three sat cross-legged in the corridor and worked their numbers. Her new bulb did not mind the audience. It cast its simple, adequate circle. She read quietly at the table and occasionally answered a question about signs and where they go. When the boys left with thanks too cool to be called gratitude, 3D leaned out of her doorway and said, "Looks good on you," nodding toward Elena's open door. "Light that belongs to the building." Elena smiled, a small thing. Maybe it always did. After midnight, she walked to the kitchen and turned the switch off and on again because muscle memory loves choreography. The light went dark, then bright, then dark again. She stood at the window and watched the streetlights cut the night into fair portions. In the blackness where her kitchen had been extraordinary, she saw her own shape in the glass, a woman in her breath. Behind her, the lamp drew the room in sensible lines. From the sink, faint as a consenting thought, the bowl on the counter reflected a ribbon of streetlight and gave it back. Elena put her hand on the table and felt only wood. She went to bed and slept in an ordinary darkness that did not require her to negotiate with the air. In the morning, when she walked into the kitchen, the light was off, and the sky handled the rest. She made coffee that cooled as coffee does. She ate eggs that were eggs. She took the old bulb from the bowl and carried it to the window. For a long minute she held it up and let it catch daylight and do nothing with it. The glass stayed cool, then slowly warmed to her fingers. She opened the window and set the bulb on the sill, a round witness to a street that went on being a street. The wind turned the plant's leaves gently toward east. The city remembered it had chores. She washed the bowl and left it to dry. That evening, when she came home late and the hall smelled like eucalyptus and new paint, a faint glow met her at the door, a reflection from across the street, a neighbor's aquarium, a sunset someone had left ajar. She unlocked her apartment and stepped into light that waited to be asked. She flipped the switch. The room obeyed. She stood in the doorway a long time, long enough to hear the building's ordinary heart, the metal and the water and the human percussion of people doing what people do when no one is watching. She listened for the second hum that had lived behind the first and, finding silence there, she felt a small, precise gratitude, like being told a secret and keeping it correctly. Before bed, she wrote one last note and taped it under the new shade. She did not check it in the morning. She knew what it said. "Thank you." Underneath, in smaller letters, a reply only she would ever see when she changed the bulb years from now. "You're welcome." She turned the light off and slept in a darkness that was simply dark and entirely hers.